When the circumstances call for it, the usually insouciant and tolerant nature of Australians is cast aside, and the natural contempt many hold for those who seek to rule them turns to anger. The best known stand against tyrannical leanings by government occurred on the Victorian goldfields in 1854 at the Eureka Stockade. Dishonest police harassed gold miners, extorting bribes and imprisoning people without due process to make a quick buck. In response to the corruption, miners began to protest and form a political union to address the issues. When the group built a stockade on Bakery Hill, it was ordered to be destroyed. Police violence led to the deaths of 22 miners and 6 police, but following the arrest of the miners involved, the outcry of the citizens of Victoria turned their seeming defeat into victory. Following a commission of inquiry, conditions were changed in favour of the miners, and half the Goldfields police were sacked. The only other time since then that a similar confrontation has occurred in Australia was in the Northern Territory in 1918. The Northern Territory is a large, sparsely populated land which ranges from arid desert in the south to tropical wetlands in the north. From 1825 to 1863 it was part of New South Wales. From 1863 to 1911 it was administered by its neighbour, South Australia. Indigenous peoples have lived on the land for tens of thousands of years, occasionally visited by Asian fishermen from the islands to the north. The capital city of Darwin, known as Palmerston until 1911, was founded in 1869, and a telegraph line connected it to Adelaide in South Australia in 1872, allowing for the start of European settlement. Discoveries of gold in 1871 near Darwin and in 1887 near Alice Springs in the south encouraged migration to the territory. In 2020, only about 1% of the population of Australia lived in the territory. The Commonwealth Government took over control of the territory from South Australia, believing that it was important for securing the military defences of the nation that it be under federal control. The Commonwealth Government took stock and found that while there was a telegraph, a railway line between Darwin and the goldfield at Pine Creek, and a pier, there wasn't much else in terms of modern civilization. Darwin was a ramshackle town of hovels and dissolute drinking dens. There were no roads outside of the town, and the population was small. Chinese residents had made up a large part of the population in the late 19th century, but young Asian people began to move away to other areas. While those who stayed were mainly elderly and infirm, Asian workers were able to command high wages due to the labour shortage. In 1911 there were only 1,729 European settlers, and 1,542 Asians. The total population had fallen by nearly 400 in almost a decade since 1903. The government decided that housing needed to be improved. The hotels nationalised, mining and agriculture expanded, and Indigenous children educated to conform to British ideals. In 1912 an administrator was appointed to manage the territory. The man chosen for the job was a Scottish-born veterinarian named Dr. John Anderson Gilruth. The 51-year-old man was greeted enthusiastically when he arrived to take up his position in April of that year, along with 4 others appointed as Director of Lands, Director of Agriculture, Director of Mining, and Chief Protector of Aboriginals. Gilruth also brought with him his wife, son and 2 daughters, as well as his private secretary, Henry Carey. Carey was soon appointed Government Secretary when the incumbent, Mr. Hates, who had long experience in the territory, was dismissed by Gilruth. It was not long before Carey had been appointed to the office of Sheriff as well. The dismissal of Hates caused a measure of indignation amongst the population, who would soon learn that Gilruth had a domineering nature and a penchant for getting his own way. Although official histories lionise him as a pillar of society, Dr. Jensen, who served as the Director of Mining, revealed how corrupt Gilruth was in an article published in the year of Jensen's death in 1966. The Director of Agriculture wanted to establish experimental farms to assess what crops would be best suited to the environment, but the administrator instead directed funds to establishing pastoral properties. The Director of Lands and the Director of Agriculture managed to convince the Commonwealth Government to set up settlers near the rivers to start farms, which was approved. Despite this, Gilruth, who did not believe in the state running any enterprise, made no provisions to assist these settlers with state stores or other means of help. Gilruth left them to starve, rather than answer their pleas for assistance. Soon after, the Director of Agriculture was sacked, and Carey got the job to add to his growing role. Then the Director of Lands was pushed out, and again Carey assumed the office. The Chief Protector of Aborigines was also dismissed after clashing with Gilruth, and of course Carey got that job too. And no attempt to educate the children would be made for another 30 years. As if Carey hadn't enough to do, he was also appointed the censor of all incoming and outgoing mail, allowing the pair to control the flow of any complaints to the government. Letters sent to and from the territory were confiscated if Gilruth and Carey objected to their contents, or could be used to their benefit. One old man who had a small grazing farm wrote to his friends mentioning youthful relationships he had had with Indigenous women. The letters were read aloud and joked about in Carey's office, and the writer blackmailed with exposure of his past dalliances. Aside from Dr. Jensen, the geologist who was director of mines, Gilruth had dictatorial powers over the territory. He even had a couple of military police acting as spies to keep tabs on the community. There were minor strikes on the wharf early in Gilruth's incumbency. One in 1913 was in sympathy with the general wharf strike throughout Australia, and another in 1914 over the issue of employing non-unionist labourers. Chinese workers under police protection were used to circumvent the strike by workers who were members of the AWU, the Australian Workers' Union. Gilruth personally was against unions, but as the Commonwealth government was Labour, he was forced to back preference of unionists. Another strike occurred as a direct result of Gilruth's actions. He had nationalised the hotels on the orders of the Commonwealth in September 1915, bringing them all under his direct control, having them remodelled and made respectable and clean. But he also raised the price of a glass by 1 penny. For some reason, people were not allowed to purchase single bottles of beer to take home, which led to sly groggers buying up cases which they sold for up to 6 shillings a bottle whenever the pubs ran out of supply. When he sacked a unionist barman and had a non-union man replace him, a beer strike was called by the irritated populace. They drank only spirits and left the beer to go sour. Gilruth retaliated by closing the hotels and prohibiting the sale of spirits in the territory, even for medicinal purposes. It was claimed that 3 old Territorians accustomed to quaffing a bottle of gin a day died from withdrawal. While Gilruth cracked down on alcohol, opium was freely available in Darwin. It was an open secret that the government launch would go out to meet steamships from eastern ports. On board would be Gilruth, Carey, and Judge David Bevan. The leaders of Darwin would then bring back the opium to sell, mostly to the Chinese community, a most lucrative sideline for them. On the 4th of February 1915, the Palmerston District Council, the only form of representative democracy in the territory, which had existed since 1874, was abolished by the Commonwealth Government and replaced with a council of 2 representatives elected by ratepayers, 2 appointed by Gilruth, and with a chairman, who naturally was H. E. Carey. Around this time, the ubiquitous Carey was asked for a dip to kill ticks on cattle at a farm in Batchelor. Carey sent a dip without any instructions on its use to the young manager, who had made the request. The dip was liquid, so the young man thought it was ready to use, but it needed to be diluted. When applied full strength to the cattle, the alkali and arsenic mixture burnt their skin, and they died in agony. Instead of reprimanding Carey, the administrator sacked the manager instead. The aggrieved young man told his story to Charles Kirkland, the editor of the Northern Territory Times, and resident of Darwin since 1878, who had already come out against Gilruth over the beer strike. The newspaper excoriated Carey over the scandal, but he remained shielded by Gilruth. Carey, in revenge, had a trumped-up charge made against the farm manager that he raped an old Aboriginal woman. The territory's judge, Bevan, sent for the manager and said if he left the territory on the next ship, the charge would be dropped. Taking the advice, the man fled the territory. Kirkland accused Gilruth, Carey and Bevan of conspiracy. If the charge was true, they should have seen that justice was done. Because they had not, it must have been a false accusation. Bevan found Kirkland guilty of contempt of court and had him jailed when he refused to pay a fine. A group of citizens raised the money to pay the fine and marched to Fanny Bay Jail to liberate the editor, who marched back into Darwin with them in triumph. While Kirkwood was implacably opposed to Gilruth, the administrator's true nemesis had arrived in the Northern Territory in 1914. Harold Nelson was an engine driver who went to Darwin as an organiser for the AWU. Nelson was also one of the 2 elected members of the council which had replaced the former democratic representation. Vestey's brothers of Great Britain had established a trade in canned meats and refrigerated foods in the late 19th century. Already on their way to becoming one of the wealthiest families in Europe, the First World War gave them an enormous increase in trade feeding the troops. The company acquired ranches and freezing works in South America and Australia. The Vestey plant in the Northern Territory was built in 1915 and employed hundreds of locals. Due to the influence of the AWU, industrial action made it a headache for the owners, and it closed in 1920. The meatworks occupied land at Parap, where Darwin High School stands today. While it was open, however, it provided a power base for Harold Nelson. It also provided something else for Henry Carey to do when he became the clerk of the company. Gilruth was not only corrupt, he was also incompetent. On trips south, Gilruth would purchase cars, trucks, and traction engines. As there were no proper roads, when these were driven out of the city, they would invariably become bogged. When this happened, the vehicles were simply left in the bush to rust away. Mrs. Gilruth must have been made of rarefied stuff, as she could not travel with the common people when venturing to Pine Creek to raise money for the Red Cross during the First World War, so a special train was run just for her benefit. Gilruth's contempt for the common people was well demonstrated by the fate of one of the farm settlers abandoned to their own luck. Most had departed the territory, but one man lacked the means to move his family, so he went to plead for the financial assistance they had been promised prior to moving north. Gilruth refused any help and ushered the man out. Sick with fever and distraught, the man drowned himself in the harbour. His wife, who was able to feed her children with the assistance of indigenous people who provided them with native food, when she heard of his death, walked 80 miles through the bush with her family to the railway at Brock Creek. A sympathetic railguard let her board, and she went to beg Gilruth for help. Just like her husband, she was snubbed by the administrator, but salvation came from the union at the newly built Vestey's Meatworks, which was canning beef for the war effort. She was given the job of manageress of the canteen. The malicious Gilruth, however, wanted her gone, so that his cruelty to her family would be forgotten. To this end he ordered a young policeman to act as a spy to find something she could be charged with. Despite her telling him to leave her alone, his pestering continued, to the point of asking her to have sex with him. She warned him if he did not desist, she would shoot him. A woman of her word, when he did not stop, she took a rifle from one of the workers and shot him in the guts. The policeman died in hospital, but with the entire town on her side, she was not even arrested, let alone prosecuted. The police instead blamed Gilruth for putting the officer in danger, and turned against him. The final acts which led to the Darwin Rebellion were twofold. With the end of the First World War, the people celebrated. 2 barmaids asked for time off to join in, and everyone was in agreement, except Gilruth, who demanded they go to work as usual. They didn't, and the next day found themselves locked out of their jobs on his orders. This act and the increasing price of a drink was stirring up feeling against Gilruth. On the 6th of December 1918, the price of a bottle of beer was raised from 1 shilling 6pence to 1 shilling 9pence. The meat workers at Vestey's were appalled by this, and the next day a meeting of 300 workers voted to boycott the hotels unless the price rise was reversed, and the price dropped to 1 shilling and 3pence. The bar staff and dining room staff at the state hotels were called out on strike on the 12th of November. The staff was suspended, which caused the barmen at the Terminus and club hotels to come out in sympathy. Boarders at the hotels had to go to Chinese and Greek cafes for meals. Another meeting was convened by the Mayor of Darwin, in which he and Harold Nelson denounced Gilruth and gained further support for the beer strike. Gilruth refused to back down, and the strike dragged on, and thirsts grew stronger. The Gilruth curse on the territory was decried in the Northern Territory Times, noting that it was incredible what the people had to put up with under his regime, and wished for a speedy and joyous deliverance from him. By 1918, the Gilruth regime had alienated so many of the population that most wage earners had joined the AWU. This gave the union immense power, as most of the clerks, messengers and typists working in the government office were sympathetic to the union and acted as informants for Harold Nelson. It was learned that Gilruth and Carey were planning to swindle an old established company out of its grazing property. The lease would soon be up for renewal, and if Vestey's were willing to pay Gilruth £20,000, He could refuse the renewal and the company would have to sell their cattle cheap to vesties. Nelson asked Carey to call a meeting of the council, saying he had a matter of vital importance to the territory to raise. At the well-attended meeting, to which Kirkland, the newspaper editor, and 2 stenographers had been invited, Nelson read out the letter. Carey blanched and indignantly accused Nelson of stealing his letter. Nelson nodded. "Yes, it is yours, and after every member of the council has read it, it will come back into your hands." The threat of arrest was brushed off by Nelson, who proclaimed by tomorrow all of Australia would know the type of administration they had suffered under for 5 years. Carey was then declared not a fit person to chair the council, and the motion was carried. Carey left, and another carried that Gilruth, Carey, the accountant Evans, and Judge Bevan be deposed, and asked to leave the territory on the first available ship. When the news spread, the union and meat workers pledged their support to the council. While the beer strike had prickled the average person, Nelson had masterfully used the letter to undermine the legitimacy of the administration. It was resolved to picket the Residency and the government offices to prevent the regime from functioning. Nelson met with police, and they came to an agreement that a protest would be unhindered the next day, and so a general strike was declared. On the afternoon of the 17th of December, the meat workers were assembled and addressed. They were told a new tactic was to be used. They were going to march on the government residence and confront Gilruth directly. Before they started off, the men were told that no violence was to be used or tolerated. About 300 or 400 men marched the 2 miles from Vesties to the residence, the manager and a brass band leading them. They were joined by more protesters in Darwin, including many of the Chinese, even though the union was run along racial lines and was for white men only. Somewhere between 700 and 1,000 men arrived at the gates, with an effigy of Gilruth in a car leading the parade. Up to 2/3 of the population were estimated to be in attendance. Aboriginal people joined in, curious to see what the tumult was about. The crowd milled about the front of the Residency, demanding the administrator speak about his term in office, while inside Gilruth refused to speak to them, and called for police to guard the gates. The situation was reiterated by Union leader Hardy Gibson. "We, the citizens of Darwin, here assembled, ask the administrator address us regarding his administration of the Northern Territory for the past 5 years. Failing to comply, that he be asked if he is willing to leave Darwin by the steamer and remain away until a public commission is granted on his administration. This meeting will guarantee him safe conduct to the steamer." Some of the crowd yelled out demanding the regime be thrown in the harbour or be hauled off to jail. Nelson called for moderation and said they would just be confined to their homes. Eventually Gilruth was convinced to meet the deputation. The 5 men entered the Residency while the rest waited outside. After half an hour they began to grow restless. 2 more men were sent in to gain a progress report. They returned with Gibson, who told the crowd, "Jock Gilruth is the same obstinate Jock Gilruth that the territory had known for the past 5 years, and would concede nothing." One of the audience said Gilruth should be given an ultimatum of appearing within 1 minute to address the crowd, which was carried boisterously. Finally, 2 hours after they had assembled, Gilruth approached the fence to address them, to a chorus of jeering boos. When asked if he and Judge Bevan would agree to leave the territory and stay away until a commission had examined his actions, he replied that as a servant of the Commonwealth he would leave when the minister told him to, and not before. Asked if the reply was satisfactory, Nelson yelled, "No!" The crowd pushed the white fence until it gave way, and then somebody shouted, "Hop over the fence!" and the crowd surged forward. Gilruth was pushed and shoved as he fled back to the protection of the building, but wasn't hurt. 3 special constables on duty were overwhelmed and disarmed of their batons and guns. Gilruth's son was escorted to safety by a big unionist, and the only damage was to some windows and a part of the tennis court. Nelson brought the crowd under control and asked them to leave as they had made their point and to go home. Before they did, they soaked the effigy of Gilruth in kerosene and set it ablaze on a bonfire, made from the palings of the demolished fence. One of the rifles taken from the constables added to the bonfire. The rebellion had succeeded in effectively ending the Gilruth regime without any bloodshed. Although they had been promised safe conduct, Gilruth and the others remained where they were, afraid to leave the protection of their homes. But after some days of house arrest, Gilruth grew restless and announced he would drive south and leave Darwin. This was considered acceptable to the council, But when he wired stations along the road to have supplies of petrol for his journey, nobody would accommodate him. So he remained a prisoner in his own home. Interstate newspapers blamed the rebellion on Bolshevism and anarchy, and the Commonwealth government sent a Navy gunboat, HMAS Una, to stand by in case the situation worsened 3 days later. In January 1919, another march went past the Residency and meetings held regarding the disgraced leader. A telegram was sent to the Prime Minister urging he recall Gilruth in the interests of life and property. HMAS Encounter was ordered to Darwin, but cautioned not to get involved unless there was violence. They found the town functioning normally. The sailors and marines went drinking in the pubs and homes of the locals, and got to hear of what had happened, and became such fervent supporters of the people that the captain feared that they would become rebellious themselves, and told Gilruth of his intention to leave without delay. Gilruth asked if he could board the ship and be taken away. The captain, glad to have a reason to leave Darwin, quickly assented. The Gilruth family boarded HMAS Encounter under cover of night on the 20th of February 1919. Only the council and Gilruth's Chinese cook and Japanese waiter were aware the administrator was fleeing in ignominy. The Gilruths never returned to the Northern Territory. The beer strike continued until it was finally called off on the 1st of April, presumably to much rejoicing. The following day, 21st of February 1919, Nelson and a carpenter named Robert Balding were each fined £3 for assaulting Inspector Waters during the rebellion. 8 months after Gilruth fled, on the 19th of October 1919, another steamer arrived in the port, and a renewed march of citizens occurred. They went to the homes of Carey, Evans and Judge Bevan, and marched them and their possessions in bullock drays down to the wharf, and asked the captain to take them. He did so only reluctantly, after being promised their fares would be paid, and that if he didn't, the 3 gentlemen would be thrown into the harbour. A royal commission by Judge Ewing of Tasmania was appointed in April 1920 to examine the affair. He found that once the population of the Northern Territory was no longer part of South Australia, they effectively lost all political rights as citizens, and had been governed in a manner no other part of the Commonwealth would tolerate for a moment. He stated, as regards the rebellion itself, no doubt the actions of the citizens in insisting upon the departure of the proscribed officials was unconstitutional, but the confidence of the public in the Commonwealth and in receiving just, impartial and humane treatment was shaken to its foundations. I find it difficult to blame the residents. As for Gilruth, while he was an able man as a scientist, he had been called upon to rule a democratic people, a role for which he was evidently unfitted. While Ewing held back from stating the administration was corrupt, he said it was at times highly improper and most unwise. Gilruth bore most of the blame, due to his general temperament and intolerant attitude for anyone who disagreed with him. Ewing was also surprised how swiftly Gilruth's bank balance had grown, noting that he had saved more in a few years on less salary than Ewing had managed to save in a lifetime. Judge Bevan had been accused of financial impropriety, especially with the Daly River mine, but although there was much reason for suspicion of impropriety, there was little evidence. Carey managed to escape most of the blame, as he was only following the orders of his superior. He had returned to Darwin as Director of the Northern Territory. A new post replaced that of Administrator, which he filled from the 1st of August 1919 until the 22nd of September 1920, when his contract was ended by the Governor-General of Australia. Less autocratic than Gilruth, he managed to negotiate with the Union and spent more freely on public works and created larger reserves for Aboriginal people. Gilruth was removed as administrator and returned to veterinary research. He died in Melbourne in 1937. Carey went to New Zealand and worked as a journalist for some years. He died there in 1964. Judge David Bevan died in Melbourne in 1954. Harold Nelson stood down as AWU Secretary in 1921 and began to campaign for a representative seat in the Commonwealth Parliament, using the slogan made famous in the American Revolution, "No taxation without representation." He was jailed briefly for not paying his taxes in June 1921, but his cause was successful. In 1922 he was elected as the first Northern Territory representative, a position he held until 1934. He died in Alice Springs in 1947. In 1973, his son Jock became the 11th administrator of the Northern Territory. The open space on which the protesters assembled to call for the ousting of Gilruth is now known as Liberty Square.